record to the cloud. There we go. So a reminder that we are recording this today, and we'll be sharing this on our Four Simple Words website later. So just a heads up on that. And again, think about those two questions for a bit, just as we do a little bit of housekeeping. And then I'm going to formally introduce CV, who you're going to love. She's so smart, and she's taught me so much, and I'm really excited about our conversation. As we always do with Four Simple Words, 2 acknowledgements to get our time going. The first is a land acknowledgement. And no matter where you're sitting today, we've got people from all over Southern Ontario, which is great. And in fact, Canada. Hi, Laura, nice to see you. So great to have you all here. And it's just a reminder that wherever we're sitting today, there were cultures and peoples and leaders that were doing great things long before we came along. And it's important for us to remember that those cultures tried to help us learn how to steward our land, water, and air. And quite frankly, we haven't done a very good job in picking up on those lessons, because we are handing our community off to future generations. So we need to better acknowledge the learning those cultures shared with us, be doing better today for those generations that come. And the other conversation that comes with that, of course, is that truth has to come before reconciliation. The other acknowledgement is a personal one. And again, you've probably all heard this from me a couple times now, but I was born white, male, middle class in Southern Ontario in the 1970s. When you combine that with the fact that I'm happily married to my beautiful wife, Melanie, I check just about every box of privilege there is. And that means that my journey to the screen today may have been very different than many of yours. And that bothers me. And that's one of the reasons we're having these conversations around Four Simple Words, is I'm doing my best to be a good ally, understand my privilege, and find ways to help other voices sing just as loudly as mine is able to. So if I need to be called on any of that today, if there's any pushback, either in the chat room or offline, I certainly will welcome that feedback. So those are acknowledgements. You're thinking about your 2 questions. What is it about servant leadership that appeals to you? And number 2, how do you feel feminism and servant leadership connect? And while you're thinking about that, just a really quick reminder on the 4 Simple Words. If you haven't heard the story yet, they were a gift from my grandmother, Mary Elsie McBride, who shared them with me when I was young. And these 4 words have followed me throughout my entire life, and they've had profound impact on how I am at home, in my community, and hopefully at work as well. And the 4 Simple Words are very simple, and that's why I love them. It's not about me. It's not about me. And it's so powerful that turning 50 last month, I wanted my gift to myself, and I hope the rest of the world, is sharing Elsie's wisdom, because I just feel there's so much good stuff going on there around those 4 Simple Words. And as I say, they've had profound impact on me, and this is either going to be a fun vanity project or something else, but this year, just chatting about these 4 Simple Words. Which leads us to today and our forum. This is, as I said, our 2nd forum that we've had. And this is one of the ways that I'm, on this journey of learning, and to have you all along with this is just, as I say, so gratifying. And our forum really today is chatting about this idea of servant leadership, which of course is this concept that it's not about me, and that as a leader, I'm going to help set direction and intent for our group that I'm leading. And then I'm going to step back and get out of their way and say, how do I help you get there? So my job is to serve the team and the mission that we're all working for together. Combine that concept with this idea of feminism, which is one that I'm, learning about and wanting to be better at. And it was such a gift to meet CV in March, who opened my mind to a number of things around feminism and expanded what that looked like for me. And I thought she would be great to pull in for the conversation today. So just before I formally introduce CV, would anyone like to share any reflections on those 2 questions around what about servant leadership appeals to you, or what do you feel that connection between feminism and servant leadership is? Really quickly, we just want to, if there's something burning that you'd like to share, put up your hand and Delbert can unmute you, and we can give you that space. Amy.
Hey, Kurt. Good morning, everybody. Just my quick thoughts on that are, it's pretty congruent with my values, and a mantra that I started following a little while ago, to not be a success value. And I think your servant leadership really focuses on being of value to others, because you're spending your time really developing and pouring yourself into other people. And I think when I think about feminism, that equity lens and putting that on top of it just really serves to heighten that idea of developing and growing and bringing people to the forefront. So that's my
Awesome.
quick reflection.
Excellent. Thanks, Amy. Any other thoughts you would like to share? Going once, going twice. All right, thanks for that, Amy. And again, keep your comments coming in the chat. Delbert's gonna be watching that for us. So let me introduce CV Harquail, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for just over a month now. Actually, my last public event was March 10th at 10 Carden. I see some 10 Carden people in the house. If you're not from Guelph, it's an amazing space that brings peoples and ideas together. And they hosted this workshop around feminism and the feminist business model canvas. And to be honest with you, I didn't know what that was, but I was intrigued. And I went in to the conversation, looking to learn, and I did. And it was such a gift to meet CV, who was facilitating the session. And she just opened my mind to this idea of what feminism is. She challenged me on what my role in that could be like. And she brought to it this level of academic and real world knowledge that I was just so thoroughly impressed with. And so we connected afterwards. We've had some good chats. I'm going to share screen for a second here and just take you over to CV's site just to plug that for a bit, because there's lots of great stuff going on there. So I'm at cvharquail.com.
That's right.
And this is where you can learn more about CV and the great work. I also want to flag her book, Feminism, A Key Idea for Business and Society. I'm about halfway through, and it's big, it's challenging, it's smart. And if you're interested in this idea of what better business could look like, and Pearl Street, as many of you know, is a B Corp, so that's something I'm really working through. I think there's lots of great ideas in there. So CV, just really quickly, she's an author, she's a management scholar, she's a consultant, she's a writer. She does her professional work through feministsatwork.com, which their logo looks surprisingly similar to ours, which is, I think, which I love. And CV has been involved as a speaker around North America and the world, in fact. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other again. And please give a big Four Simple Words welcome to CV Harquail. Yay, CV. Yay, there it is. Good morning, CV.
Good morning, you guys. Is it okay for me I want to make a couple of assumptions. First, I want to just confirm that everybody is here because there's something in the idea of servant leadership that is kind of compelling and supportive of the kind of role that you want to play when you're working with other people. Is that fair to assume, or are there some folks here who are also kind of skeptical or quizzical about the concept, or just really don't even have a purchase, a handle on it yet? What's the feeling in the room around servant leadership? You can just give me a thumbs up in the windows if you're like okay on it, or like do this if you're like not sure. And then I'll scroll around. And I know, isn't that weird? It's so hard to learn how to get a sense of the room and read the room.
Yeah.
Okay, but it looks like generally folks are find something really kind of compelling and useful in the idea of servant leadership. So I think that's a really good thing to confirm, because my hope in our conversation today is that I'll be able to share some ideas and a little bit of some criticism about how servant leadership can be understood, and then invite you to think about how we can use some feminist ideas, particularly around feminist views on leadership, so that you can take what you've heard and learned about servant leadership so far and kind of inform it and expand it so that it fits the vision that you want to move forward in your own work and in your work with other people. So that's my goal. And to do that, I want to talk about kind of things in 3 chunks. The first chunk is the kind of almost, it's a little lecture-y, I guess, and that's really talking about what feminism is now, because understanding the current definition of the feminist movement and the feminist perspective is really important for getting all of us kind of on shared footing. And then the second thing I want to talk about is sort of feminist leadership and what feminist leadership asks of us, and then take those 2 ideas and turn them to look at the commonplace understanding of servant leadership to see how we can expand and challenge that so that as a concept, it fits us better and supports us better in our work. So that's where I'm planning to go. And I'm hoping that after the first part where I'm talking about feminism, the kind of contemporary definition, at that point, we can really throw it open for more conversation versus presentation. But I'll, if I can, launch into the presentation part so that we can get that shared foundation.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, EP. Perfect.
Okay. All right. I just want everyone to give me some body action here because we need a little somatic connection. Only because your faces are beautiful and most everyone has great lighting, but I just want to make sure that like I have some affirmation. Oh, and the second thing I wanted to tell you is, so I've never used screen share before in a Zoom where I was in charge. So this is all going to be new to me. So as I clonk around with my mouse, join me in this learning journey, if you will, this technical learning journey. Okay, let's see that one. Whoops, I forgot to hit screen share. You guys, see, I screwed it up already.
You got it.
Have I got it? Are we on? All right, I'm screen sharing.
Good.
And I'm sharing again. And then I guess I have to hit
there
this.
You go.
Okay, so this is a perfect example of how like embarrassed you get and then you get embarrassed. All right, we're gonna play from here. Is this working? This is
there you
working.
go. You got it.
Thank you very much for your patience. When I was teaching MBA students, the most horrifying moment for me would be when I would have to go over to the side and hit all the things on the pad to turn on and off a video. And it got to the point where I would never show videos in class because I was too afraid I would like mess up the tech. And can I say I consult with tech businesses. So the idea that I would struggle with the tech is kind of embarrassing, but that's how it is. So I want to kind of talk at first about servant leadership through a feminist lens, understanding that this is something we're all going to be kind of working on and learning on together. The first place that we have to start, though, is with this understanding of what feminism is. And so usually when I start to talk about feminism and business, I find that if you ask the average person what they will say, when you say, what is feminism? They'll talk about it as being equality for women. And when they mean equality for women, they mean going from a situation where the men have more power or are more dominant, they're the standard, and women are subordinate, they're smaller, they're the extra, they're the ones that we have to call the lady tennis players instead of the tennis players. And what people are thinking of when we think about equality is this idea that what would happen with women is that women would come up to the same place as men, and then women and men would be equal. And what happens there is because we live in a world that is so heavily structured by racism, by classism, by settler colonialism, by capitalism, we always are assuming equality in the social identity group or the people like us group. So when I'm usually thinking about equality for women, or most people are, we're thinking about equality in our group, but we're not thinking about the equality among other groups of men and women who might have different social positions or social identities from ours. And so when I think about equality for women, I'm also thinking about equality among women. So all of the women come up to the top, and then ultimately equality for everyone. So you've probably heard that phrase, I'm not free till everybody's free, which is often attributed to Fannie Lou Hamer, but I'm just thinking it was somebody else like Emma Goldman or something who actually said that first. But in any case, the idea being feminism is about not just women getting equality with men in a certain group, but about women being equal across all groups, and women and men and people of any gender presentation or expression all being equal in terms not so much of the way that the law treats them, but the way that we understand each other as human beings who have a right to live and a right to determine how we want to live and a right to be happy and flourishing. So if you have that in the back of your mind, it brings us to this definition of feminism, which is the contemporary definition that I offer in my book. And that is basically that feminism has three parts. The first part is to end sexism and all forms of oppression. So including settler colonialism, white supremacy, bias towards capital, and so on. Its second part is to establish a political, social, and economic equality and justice. And we put the word justice in there to remind people that we're not talking simply about equal treatment under the law, but we're really talking about a world in which everyone has an equal opportunity to live a flourishing life. And then the third piece of the definition of feminism is that feminism is about creating a world where everyone flourishes. And this is a piece of the definition that a lot of folks miss, because historically, feminism has been about righting wrongs. It's been about defending in a world where people are constantly being hurt. But the other part of feminism is the invitation to start using feminist values to envision a future that's different and better, where everyone can participate. And so it's not just that idea of negative liberty, of being free from constraints, but it's positive liberty in the sense that we're all equally able to create a world where we can all flourish together. So that's the contemporary definition of feminism that I work with. And let me just check in with you all. How does that feel with you? How does that definition hit you? Does it seem crazy? Does it seem okay?
Thumbs up, thumbs down. What are people thinking?
Okay, let us know if you have any questions about any, like start raising your hands when you're ready to, so Delbert can bring you in if you have questions.
Yeah,
So
feel free to use the chat as well.
Oh, okay. Given that understanding or definition of feminism, I want to tell you that one of the core insights of feminism, that's also a piece that oftentimes people don't quite get, is so in feminism, we talk a lot about gendering, the relationships between men and women and people who are neither men nor women. And we talk about masculine and feminine, and we talk about this whole system of gendering. But what really we need to understand is that gendering, like racializing people, like putting people into social classes, it's a story, it's a strategy for making it seem okay that some people have power over others. So gendering has been a story that's been told for, centuries, that explains why men should have power over women, because men are stronger, they're taller, they're more rational, they don't have to worry about breastfeeding. They're the hunters, not the gatherers. All of these stories are just to legitimate a world where we let men have power over women and think that there's only men and women in the world, and not question it. And so feminism says, let's look at this process of gendering and recognize it's a process of power relations. Let's look at racism and recognize it's about power relations. Let's look at settler colonialism. It's about power. It's about making some group able to have power over others. And that is something that if you believe that all human beings are equal, there's no explanation for any group having automatic power and unquestioned power over anybody else. So with that core insight of feminism in mind, we can talk about the three things that feminism does when we start to bring it into the conversation about business or organizing or politics or getting stuff done. And feminism makes three interventions in our way of thinking about the world. The first one is that it asks us to add and value women's voices. If women and other people have been marginalized and not heard from, marginalized and not believed, marginalized and not considered, first thing is to bring these people and their experiences into the world as valid points of view and valid concerns. The second intervention is pushing towards equality and recognizing that whatever system we're in, there's no excuse for some people having more power over others, and we should all be equal. But we don't want to be equal in a dying system. We want a system that lets everyone flourish. And so our third intervention in feminism is reimagining the future, and doing that by applying a feminist lens to understand what's going on, and by drawing on feminist values to have a platform or a set of catalysts or some guideposts for thinking about what the world could be. And so when I think about leadership conversations, all of the leadership conversations that all of them need to be changed in three ways. First, they need to add and value women's perspectives and the perspectives of other marginalized people. They need to be working so that all of us can use them equally well. And they also need to be helping us reimagine and transform the future. So those are the three criteria that I bring to any conversation about a perspective on leadership. So this is one of those slides that you're told as a professor or a presenter, never, ever, ever, ever to do. So I'm going to apologize for that. But I did it because I don't know why I did it, because I didn't want to, in any case. What I want to offer you here in this humongous slide is a definition of feminist leadership. And feminist leadership, a feminist perspective on leadership, and I want to highlight different chunks of this. First, it's using a feminist perspective and an acknowledgement of social justice, both at the individual and the collective level. It's all about transforming ourselves. Our challenge with feminist leadership is to use power, resources, and skills, all of those things, not to be afraid of power, not to be afraid of skills, not to think we don't have access to resources, but to use them in non-oppressive, inclusive structures and processes. So to figure out how to use this stuff in a way that is anti-oppressive and that makes for equality and agency for everyone. And here's where it starts to get a little bit bigger picture. It's to mobilize other people and yourself around a shared agenda, emphasis on shared, not just my agenda. And that agenda has to include not only the work we're doing today, whether that is figuring out how to get this product to market, or it's figuring out how to fund the new co-working space, whatever it is, we want to be doing that work in a way that moves forward social, cultural, economic, and political transformation. We don't want to just fit it into the system. We want to use it as a way to change the system. And then finally, we have our eye on the end goal, which is equality and flourishing for everyone. So when we think about feminist leadership, it incorporates things like, what is the mindset that we need to take in? Who are the people who are going to be changed? What is the process that we want to use? Non-oppressive, shared agenda with other people. And the big picture goal around all of the everyday work that we do is to transform the world so that we can all flourish. So that's kind of a bigger leadership remit than your conventional form of leadership, where you're going to go in there and get everyone motivated and aligned and inspired to go do good work and to lower our costs and improve our profit margin and expand our market position. It's more than that, and leadership is more than that. Which reminds me, I have never figured out a good way to explain this part, but it's a really key thing when you start to think about leadership, when you're reading leadership books or looking at leadership advice. Most of the stuff that we learn about leadership, especially in a business school, has been theorized about and practiced in organizations, usually businesses. And people forget that's just like that's kind of like the leadership stuff that we talk about is like the icing on the cake. And people forget how much of the cake supports that icing. People forget that the leadership ideas that we usually talk about are ideas that work in organizations and structures that are already making people aligned, already making people behave, already making people motivated. And they're often doing that through hierarchy, through oppression, which is a word we don't use in business schools very much. And they're doing it through the threat of violence. So every time you talk about somebody being a leader in business, you have to remember that that person is leading in an environment where, you know what, if those people he or she is working with don't get aligned, they lose their jobs. They lose their livelihoods. They get low performance evaluations. They are punished. Our conventional understanding of leadership is the icing on this cake of a structure that is built to make people comply and that is built to control people. So when you think about those leadership skills, you can understand that in a world without that structure, without that oppressive foundation, that leadership stuff is just not going to cut it. It's not enough. We also find that a lot of the leadership conversation, and this is true with the conversation about servant leadership also, is that a lot of the conversation we have about leadership now, we're implicitly and sometimes explicitly trying to fix problems that are caused by the control, the compliance, the threat in the systems that we're working with. If you're thinking about your own leadership in a volunteer organization or perhaps a church organization or a community organization, it's not the case that you have these structures supporting your work. But in the back of people's minds, there are a lot of implicit assumptions that we don't even check that are supporting this conversation about leadership. And when we want to change that system, our understanding of what leadership is also has to change. And that's why when you look at that definition of feminist leadership, there's so many steps, because all of these are things that we need to do to clear that oppressive foundation off and build something different. So unfortunately for servant leadership has been, let's say, tainted. Oh wait, one other thing. Servant leadership I'll get to in a minute, but just about feminist leadership in particular, if you try to go find a book on it, it'll be hard to do, because feminist leadership is much more of a practice than it is a set of theories. And that is because it is co-created, shared, and the property of a group. Leadership in a feminist world is something we all do together. It's not something that I can learn how to do or bring to the party. It's something that's co-created. It emphasizes this notion of power with, and power with is a very early feminist construct from the 1920s, where Mary Parker Follett, who's a feminist management theorist, identified several different kinds of power, the most important ones being power over, which is power to make people do stuff, and power with, which is this power that we create together horizontally in the group so that we all move forward. Feminist leadership is also experimental because it's highly driven by the context and by the people involved. And it's prefigurative, which is the fancy way of saying you're building the bridge as you walk on it. You're figuring out the processes that express your values today as we get to a world that expresses those values. It's focused on transforming the system. It addresses all kinds of power dynamics, not just gender. And then importantly, it makes invisible work visible. And invisible work are things like emotional labor or relational labor or taking care of the group, because those are all ways that power can be created with each other or that power can be used to control each other. So those are some things about feminist leadership practice, just to keep in back of your mind. But essentially, it's a lot of experimentation informed by values. So let me shift now to talk about servant leadership and think about what servant leadership is or is often presented as. And when I was going back and looking at the definitions of servant leadership all the way back to the 40s and to Greenberg, who came up with the idea, here are some of the qualities that a servant leader is said to these are things you're supposed to do if you're a servant leader. You're supposed to listen, be empathic, focus on healing the group, be aware, persuade folks. And when I look at that list, I see something more than a set of leadership principles or emphasis. What I see is a list of really gendered constructs. And if we go down this list and ask the question, who usually does this, women or men? So who usually listens, women or men? Women. Who usually is empathic, women or men? Women. Who's usually focused on healing, women or men? Women. Who's usually aware of what's going on for other people? Women. Who has to get things done through persuasion rather than direction? Women. Who has to have big picture thinking? That one is kind of like, maybe that's more classically done by men. Foresight, possibly men, but also women. Commitment to the growth of other people, usually women. And so when I look at the characteristics of good servant leadership, what I see is a list of characteristics of effective women in our culture, and particularly in a white North American culture. Most of them are feminine traits and not masculine traits. And I think this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. The first one is that these are also traits that people use when they don't have positional power and when they don't have power over. When you can't tell people what to do, you persuade. When you can't be the one who directs what's said, you listen. When other people are in pain and you want to help heal that pain, you're empathic. And these are largely characteristics that are used by people who don't have positional power. The other reason why the gendering of these is important is that if you're a woman and you ascribe to conventional servant leadership and you think about performing these practices, sometimes it can be really good for you because you're fitting into the gender role that the bulk of society thinks you should have. When you're empathic and when you're persuasive and when you listen well, you're doing all the good things that good women do, and people will see that and reward you for it. They may not see it as leadership though, because these are qualities that women are supposed to have naturally. So therefore, they're not things that they have to work hard to perform, and they're not necessarily seen as skills. The gendering messes up men, but in a different way. When men are trying to practice servant leadership as it's conventionally understood, they're seen as wimps. They're seen as soft. They're seen as not agentic and not powerful by the convention. So if you perform or pursue a servant leadership style, if you're a woman, you'll fit the gender role, the gender expectations, and people will like you for that, but you may not necessarily be rewarded and you may not be seen as skilled. And if you're a man and you do this, you're emasculating yourself and you're not fitting into the tough guy model that many people are expecting you to present in your organization or recognize as leadership. So the gendering of it can be ineffective regardless of which gender you are. And if you are a gender nonconforming person and you don't fit one of those two, then you're really kind of messed up because nobody knows how to fit you in there. So that's one concern about the gendering of servant leadership. And people have tried to address this by asking their organizations to understand and redefine what good leadership looks like. And in those situations, it can be very powerful, and executing or performing this kind of leadership in this way can be really useful. But a lot of organizations just implicitly disregard these qualities for a bunch of different reasons. So that's one thing that we think of from a feminist perspective, looking at servant leadership. Another, so I should ask, I have a hard time talking. Does anybody have any questions about this so far? Does this like seem weird, or do you have any things that you want to add or ask about?
Put up your hands or give us a wave. I told you this was going to be good.
Yeah, a wave, or preferably if you can throw it in the chat, I can find you and unmute you as well.
Oh, Tara. Tara's waving. I can see Tara over in my screen.
Hi, Stevie. This is amazing. I'm loving this. One question I do have, because I'm not as familiar with the servant leadership side, I'm guessing that these are the qualities from the servant leadership side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know that this is a very non-feminist leadership question to ask, but always asked when we put forward feminist ideas is there data behind these particular qualities, like actually improving leadership and improving outcomes, that sort of thing?
Yep, there is. Yeah, so, and I am never able to, I can't offer you citations at this moment, but what we know are things like using these skills does really help connect a community of people and move a community of people forward. So we know that they work in general. We also know that people who aim to lead this way can be very effective at leading in two situations. One situation is where their organization acknowledges this and recognizes this as leadership and supports them in it. And the other is when they're in an organization where they're totally screwed and they have no other options but to kind of do the work around. And these are all qualities that make it possible for you, if you are not in a formal leadership position, to get stuff done, because they can be very good at working around the system. So they do work. But one of the things that's really a challenge about leadership conversations in general is that the conversation tends to focus on two things: this idea of who you are as a person, and this idea that you can take these leadership skills and use them anywhere. And that seems to ignore not only who you are as a person, maybe not being a cis white hetero, male, but also it might be a situation where the demands of the work that need to be done or the demands of the organizational context just really don't mesh very well. It might not mesh very well with the culture. So
CV, can I just jump in on that?
More situational than people recognize, I think. Sorry.
CV, can I just jump in? A couple of resources to Tara's question around, and I think it was around, what proof do we have that servant leadership works? A couple of resources, and I'm just looking at the blog here. Give and Take by Adam Grant, and these wouldn't have the gender lens that CV is putting on this today, but in terms of my own understanding and kind of proof of the pudding, Give and Take by Adam Grant, phenomenal, where he really drills down on the power of giving. And the other one is Trust by David Johnson, former Governor General. Really powerful stuff around practical, and this is part of my eye-opening, and sorry, CV, I'll just very quickly, this was part of the eye-opening, oh, this actually does work. It isn't just something I've been practicing, it actually is, there's a methodology to it. And I think we all, to CV's point, we all need to be stretching what that looks like. Give and Take by Adam Grant, Trust by David Johnson were two books for me that gave me some numbers, if you will, and there are others, but those are two that I've read recently that have done that. So just to add into back to Tara's question. Excellent. So CV, how do we take, Tara's question is a perfect transition into what do we need to reconsider about servant leadership with this new knowledge that we have and understanding of feminism? What are some of those shifts we need to make, and what did that look like practically day to day?
Yeah. Well, the first one is to just bring a lens to it that asks the question of how are these characteristics and behaviors gendered? How does that fit with who I am and what I'm able to do? Right. And how does that fit with the organization's expectations? So just knowing that it doesn't bounce the same for every person in every organization is the first start. But thinking about books and stuff that talk about servant leadership, there's a new one out, and I'm sure you are all familiar with Simon Sinek's work on Start With Why and stuff like that. So he has this new book out, and it's called Leaders Eat Last. And I was talking with my girlfriend, Kelly Deals, about this book because I don't like this book. And the reason I don't like this book is because who eats last? Let me just ask you, when you have a big family dinner, who's the person eating last?
Mom.
It's usually the mom and the grandmom. And historically in this world, the women eat last because they've done all the work to serve everybody else. And Simon Sinek is proposing, as a lot of servant leadership conversation does, that the better way to move through this world and to influence and help people is to put yourself behind everybody else and to step down into this role of servant, knowing that you've given up the privilege and position that you could have had by eating first or eating at the head table. And so there's this presumption in the conversation about servant leadership that the people who are starting out as servant leaders are starting from a position of some kind of privilege, which they are then going to give up or step down from so that they can serve everyone else. And there's an attitude in there that's really unhealthy. And that attitude is like, first of all, in the back of my mind, look at me, I get a cookie, look what I've given up. But there's also this recognition that push comes to shove, I can get back up on that place and lead from the old direction. So that's one kind of scary thing about the conversation about servant leadership. But even if you take out where do we come from? So people with privilege can step down and serve in this kind of noble way. But people without privilege have been doing this shit for forever, and no one's patted them on the back for it.
Right.
So it's very different when you're choosing it from a position of privilege versus if you've been forced into it your whole time and you're like, at some point, could I get some structural or organizational acknowledgement for my expertise and skill and lead like normal people or conventional people?
Conventional, yeah.
So there's that in there. So that's a thing that happens in this conversation a lot. That's not to say that people who are compelled by servant leadership are all like, I'm going to be so good, give me my ally cookie. A lot of us come to this conversation because finally somebody's recognizing and validating the way that we really feel we want to interact with other people. So it's not like a total criticism. There's also a recognition in there that this is giving us something that the other conversations about leadership don't give us.
Right. And this concept of the motivation for servant leadership, like, am I being forced into it or am I choosing it? Like, that's a really, my mind's being blown. I don't know if everyone saw that, but my head just popped off. Like, that's a really important conversation, I think, for us as servant leaders to have. So so walk me through what that looks like, CV, and welcome. If there's questions specifically you got for CV, I want to help. How do we normalize that decision, or how can we more embrace encouraging people to make the choice to be a servant leader versus looking for the hero cookie? Like, what can we, and this is big, and how do we?
There's the hero cookie, but there's also this, I've been doing this my whole goddamn life.
Right.
No one's ever seen it as leadership. And maybe for once I would like, so there's I get to choose it and I'm a hero. Mm-hmm. But there's also it's never been acknowledged before. And I don't even know, I don't have a good way to put language around that, but there's, I kind of like going biblical. I think of it as kind of the prodigal son thing.
Right.
Where, the prodigal son goes off and comes back and the fatted calf and all the good wine. And then the son who's been there the whole time doing the work, nada. Right. And I feel like for people who, there's the cookie and there's the nada kind of dynamic.
Let's open it up for some thoughts, because this is a really, this is such a great conversation. I want to bring some more voices in. Thoughts on this idea of how else we need to reconsider or reimagine servant leadership with this conversation that we're having today. I'll put up your hand to see, Delbert, can you?
I'll stop the share for a minute so that we can have more people in our gallery.
Thanks, Evie.
Yeah, we got a bit of a stream, so I'm just making sure I got everyone here. John has a question. There's an expression, I lead from behind. Could you unpack the position or stance of a servant leader?
Yeah, so that is the stance of the servant leader is I lead from behind, and I'm kind of hurting people, or I let them take the lead, or it's I lead from below, I'm holding them up. From a feminist perspective, it's different. It's we lead together with each other. We are all equals. And I think one of the dicey pieces of the servant leadership conversation is this idea that you're still separate from and still underneath and still the only servant, versus we are all here together, working together with each other, giving each other what we need to move our shared agenda. Yeah.
Excellent. I think I saw Tanya had a question. Did I see Tanya's hand up? T. Framps there. I can, sure, I got it. Let me unmute you, Tanya. Hi, good to see you.
Hi. Trying to figure out how to quickly talk about this, but one of the reasons that I'm here today is because I recognize what I thought was servant leadership was actually just servant. And that's one of the things that drew me in. So talking about, when we're talking about the person at the spectrum who maybe hasn't been doing it by choice and thought they were demonstrating servant leadership, but then I realized it wasn't true leadership. And I wanted to have that conversation about boundaries, and that's still caring for the self, and it's still including the self in that it's not about me. So looking back on, say, my career or what I'm doing now, and though I'm getting better at it, it took a lot to realize that what I thought was doing for others was really just almost martyrdom and exhausting myself being the helper, but that's wasn't really being the leader I wanted to be. And so maybe some way of closing that gap between a hero cookie and the servant is a conversation about boundaries and what that servant piece truly means. And that also then tends to push towards greater recognition by those around you of you as a leader, when there are those boundaries and that almost recognition and respect for self in there.
Thanks, Tanya. CV.
Yeah, so there's this great word, and it's so Catholic, the concept of self-abnegation, abnegating your own importance or your own self-needs or who you are as a person in the service of others. And there's a way, that's like a real danger in the servant leadership perspective. And it is critically important that everyone who is leading is able to care for themselves and grow themselves as they are working with others. So it shouldn't be a case where you're giving up so much of yourself, right, that you're not valued or you're depleted or you're not as important as those you're serving or things like that. So there's that element to it. But one of the other things I hear in in how you were framing that is something that's pretty classic, which is that we focus on the role of the leader rather than the practices of leading. And the real challenge is to shift from thinking that there's a leader who does stuff for the rest of us or to the rest of us, but in this case, a leader who does stuff for us versus leading behaviors that we all share with each other and that we exchange with each other so that we all move forward together. So in my book, I have an essay on leadership and a bunch of different leadership paradigms. And I use this analogy of the dining room table and people sitting around the dining room table. And servant leadership is where everyone's sitting around the table except for the quote unquote leader. And he or she is walking around with a platter, giving things to everyone else. And then there's no food left at the end. And that's kind of the paradigm of servant leadership at its worst. But then the feminist leadership perspective is that there's a table and it's a round table and everyone there is equal and everyone is passing food to each other and everyone is nourished.
Right.
And one of the biggest things I want people to think about when they're expanding their notion of servant leadership is to take away this idea that there's a role of leader that one person has. Right. And instead focus on leadership that we can all do for each other. I want that part to change. But I want to invite you to look at that role of that idea of serving others and being of service to others and connecting with others and caring for others, because there's beautiful humanity in that when you take away the oppressive power dynamics. And I want you to hold on to that idea of making things happen with others because you are caring with them and sharing resources with them and receiving also from them. And that's what the serving, it's not servant as a role, but it's serving
yes,
as a set of behaviors.
Right. And maybe just to quickly jump in, you know, part of my learning and discovery is that I'm not always a nice guy when I'm serving, right? Sometimes we have to have courageous conversations. We have to make difficult conversations as well. And I've gotten better at that through my career, but sometimes the truth needs to be told, or realities need to be, you know, checked, whatever it is. Sometimes I'm serving you best by putting the truth in front of you, which isn't coddling. It isn't necessarily making you feel better, but it's the honest to goodness conversation we need to have. And equal and tandem to that is that then you can come back to me and say, here's the truth you need to be hearing as well. So I think to that point of that equality piece, which I think is a really interesting word that we haven't, that is kind of weaving in and out of today's conversation for me, is that, yeah, I do have some responsibilities as a leader, and it's a two-way street on that.
Right.
If that makes
but
sense.
It's responsibilities of leading, not the static role of a leader. It's of the activity.
Great. Yes.
Around,
Yes. Yeah.
Around moving things.
I need to watch that.
And
That's good.
you know, the leader conversation is like a real default of big concept, a neoliberal, late capitalist approach to how things get done. We've been taught that it's all about the individual. It's either the heroic individual or the one who's like totally screwing up that needs to be fixed.
Right.
Rather than looking at the system and rather than looking at the community. And somebody in the chat mentioned the idea of the question of, behind or to the side. And it made me think of that phrase, you've either got to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And that always irked me because there's a fourth option. And that option is get in there with everybody. You don't have to lead, you don't have to follow, you don't have to add something.
Right.
No, what you need to do is be in the mix with others, connecting with them, figuring out together where you're going to go, and bringing your personal gifts to the party.
Right. And I think that actually, and I'm conscious of our time because I want to make sure we let one go at noon. There's a comment in here that maybe just we can wrap up in your reflections on CV. This is from Amy, who's a great servant leader, and I've got a lot of time for her. She does some amazing things in our community and at work. And her observation here is there are many different leadership approaches. My default is servant leadership. However, recently in this time of COVID, there was a need to become far more directive. Mm-hmm. How does that fit? And I think that's a really interesting conversation. And we got about 2 minutes left. Your thoughts, CV?
That is a great conversation. It makes me go automatically to New Zealand and to what Jacinda Ardern is doing. And we all know that what she is bringing to the party are all of these classically feminine qualities or classically servant leadership behaviors. She is being empathic. She is understanding. She's giving people information. She is understanding the emotions. She's speaking them clearly. She's modeling. She's doing all of this stuff that we know is great leadership behavior. And she's also in a position of structural power. And she's using both of those things.
Right.
It's the power. I would say it's her role as prime minister that's letting her be directive, but it's her understanding in her leadership skills and the needs of the community that's making it clear to her that people are longing for clarity. They need some shaping. They need to know what zone or what level of threat they're working with. They need to know what is good behavior and what is ineffective behavior. And so she's using her power position, her structural power position to make things happen, but she's using her leadership to understand what's needed and to bring what's needed together with what she's able to do.
Excellent. That is, thank you.
Elon Musk, go slap him. He's a bad example of Canadian, everybody. He's just
don't get me going. Don't get me going.
Yeah, I don't, wow.
There's lots of bad examples out there. It's nice we got some good ones to point to. I see Mike made a comment here. In education, we call that leadership co-learner, which I think is really, you know, back to your, I love that metaphor of we're all having dinner together, right? Food is being passed to everyone and everyone's benefiting from it. I think that's really, that speaks volumes. That is our time. We're about 1 minute to 12. Join.
Wait, one other thing, Kurt.
Quickly,
So
yeah.
I want to share just one other thing, and I'll screen share for a minute and then I'll unscreen share.
Absolutely.
So, whoops. So Kurt, when I was first getting to know him and his initiative, so he uses this phrase, it's not about me. And I personally find this phrase kind of problematic because I read it and I'm like, it's not about me. What? I don't matter? What? I have to give up myself, or, you know, I've got to be whatever. And so my 4 words would be something more like it is about us. But if you come from a world where it's been all, you're so great, blah, 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 you can say, no, it's not about, it's like, what's happening? Is it used to be about me and it's not about me? Or is it's not about me, it's about us? And that phrase, it's not about me, fits into the conversation differently depending on where you're coming from and where you're going.
Yes.
I realize that's sort of like, wow, a cone or something, but K-O-A-N, but, or like but this idea of it's not about me resonates so differently depending on where it is in your own leadership sentence.
Right. I love that. And I think that also for me ties into this idea of leader versus leading, right? Yes. And you're tripping into one of the chapters in the future book. So well done. So there's lots of good stuff ahead on this one. I really want to honor our time. Let's give a round of applause to CV for her brilliance and her sharing today. CV,
Thank you,
thanks
everybody.
so much.
Thank you.
Another round of applause for Delbert for managing our technology. Yay, Delbert. Good man. Thanks so much. And so on behalf of CV, Delbert, and myself, thank you all so very much for being a part of this. 4 Simple Words brought us together today. It is not about me. That's those 4 simple words today. We're going to keep evolving those. My challenge back to you today is, what's one word that you're leaving with today upon reflection of our great conversation? And if there's one word that's really sitting with you, or you're wrestling with, you're trying to figure out, welcome some conversations on social on what that is. And you can find us at FourSimpleWords.ca. But if there's one word of reflection or thought that you'd like to share with the world on our conversation, I would really welcome that on social or offline. So that is 12 o'clock. Everyone, thank you again so much for your time. A pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. And I hope you all have a very safe and hand-washing filled weekend. Take care, everyone.